Hi all. It's real nice to be here at last. Migraine free, very much here for the for me to pass along the passion that I got for the concept of identity. Massive, colossal concept. It's got a ton of interesting stuff to it, and I was looking to personalize it. I was looking to informalize it, and I was looking to, structure the heck out of it, but also make sure that it is accessible to you on a very personal level, right? So, what's it to me, identity? How is it going to guide me towards stuff? How is it going to have me look at things? Is it going to challenge my views? Is it going to confirm certain things about how I see the world and myself in it, right? The major point of all this is informing your choices today and in the future, and kind of looking at your experience up until now in retrospect, right? And kind of analyze where you've been and where you're going to. Alrighty, here we are. The style of the presentation is fun and funky and almost unserious. And it's all being done on purpose because the things that we're going to be looking at are pretty academic. A huge chunk of it is academic. So I'm looking to kind of shorten the distance between the difficulty behind the academic terminology and the visuals so that we can better grasp how, in fact, personalizable all this knowledge is going to be. Hi, I'm your identity. Basically, the presentation is saying hello. And there's a lot to me. And this is just an introduction. So the bunch of slides we're going to be looking at, some of the vids that we're going to look at, some of the questions that we're going to ask ourselves, that is just, identity 101. So there's a lot to dig for, but the major stuff, it's all in here. Or so I want to believe. So let's do this. Move onwards. So first of all, we got to start somewhere. And I just want to present you with what the agenda looks like and what terms we're going to dig into as part of this lecture. Identity can be ascribed and inhabited. So as you look at those terms, right? So if you ascribe something to someone, you kind of attach it to them, attribute to them, and it's not up to you what they attribute to you. That's when it's ascribed. Inhabited, right? So cohabiting, inhabiting my apartment, right? So I cohabit with my husband, my dog, and my stepson. He's going to move out in September. Yay! For him, for me, for all of us. And it's about basically creating the actual habitat. But in this case, it's very much metaphorical because it's not about where you are geographically, but where you are in terms of how you identify and what you identify yourself with and why. And it comes from the inside as opposed to someone else's, perception of you. Moving on to subjectivity, a gorgeous word indeed. So if we look at how it's defined in Merriam-Webster, it's pretty accessible. So the quality, state, or nature of being subjective. Subjectivity. So it's one of those cases where you technically got three stresses. Subjectivity. Now, the thing is with subjectivity is it really has to do with things being not objective. Now, what does that mean exactly? And why is this of importance to us? Because it's got to do with identity being built with a bunch of perceptions. Again, some of them ascribed, some of them inhabited, right? But it's all going to be informed by this notion of things being subjective, and subjective does not mean wrong. Okay, so for now, this is what I'm going to tell you. We're going to go far deeper than that. Now, identity also means subject positions and positionings. I have mentioned positioning to you most certainly. And basically the answer to what positioning is inside the word, right? So positioning is what? Taking on a certain position. or again, being ascribed a certain position and navigating those choices. So we're going to look further into how this works. Moving on further. So now, the agenda itself, right, has got three major parts to it. So identity and society, so sociolinguistics, pragmatics of identity, how it's actually applicable in everyday life. Looking at things like history and where we have gotten throughout the years, throughout the centuries, and what it was informed by and why and who was behind it. Identity inscriptions and categories. This takes us back to things being ascribed to us and taken on ourselves. We're going to look at the terms other and othering, which is real interesting when it comes to our perceptions of ourselves as speakers, as people who've got certain tendencies in pronunciation, who've got certain skills and competencies. Now we've got identity and language in terms of accents, which is of great interest to us given the work that we're doing. It's a virtual retreat that's got to do with voice and accent and how accent is shown in our voices. Right, we've got dialect. We're going to look at the difference between an accent and a dialect. We're going to look at the so-called transnational identities dictated by the world having really very much changed over the past 30 years, with people migrating and becoming digital nomads, getting globalized and cosmopolitanized in an attempt to become part of new landscapes once they've moved to a new place and have become an immigrant. So whatever the circumstances, we've got tons and tons of people finding themselves in a new context. And when it happens for, decades and decades on end, it becomes a tendency, it becomes the new normative, and it's something to very much take into account when you look at yourself and your history and the history of your voice and the place you find yourself in today, emotionally as well. Then we've got identity and you. What is open to you? Again, back to the personalizing of this work. You're going to look at yourself and your persona, something that you may be presenting to the world that isn't always consistent with what you've got going on inside. And you got to look into ways to, have those be whole and wholesome, integrity-driven you, right? So it shouldn't be two different people, one that you present to the world and one that you present to yourself. Looking at language as capital. So that is my favorite, thinking of it as a form of enriching yourself. And looking at your inner qualities, because identity, personality, they certainly do inform each other and lots. So that's what we're going to be looking into in batches, right? So we've got three pillars, it's a triad. But first, let us take a look at a quote that might get you thinking about what this identity stuff is all about and why it is of importance to us, why it is of significance, like why look at it in the first place. So again, today, in the world that we're in, identity is, central to all kinds of debates and discussions and discourses because it is changeable. It's no longer fixed. So let's just look at this gorgeous quote. It's got two parts to it. And here we go. Identity becomes an issue when the self ceases to be taken for granted. Today, identity has become an issue because the reference points for the self have become unstuck. I love this word. I'm going to plant my feet now and do as I preach. The capacity for autonomy is no longer held in check by rigid structures. Well, in, non-fascist societies, anyway, such as class, gender, national ethnicity. Things have gotten super fluid, perhaps overly fluid at times, but that's a whole different matter. Moving on to the second bit of it. What is it going to be? And boom. See how playful the presentation is? The self can be invented. I love this word in many ways. Invented, reinvented, discovered, rediscovered, built, rebuilt, constructed, reconstructed, especially given that you've got so many parts to it when you speak multiple languages. So the contemporary understanding of the self is that of a social self, right? So it's not just you in isolation, in echo chambers, but it's you and the world and you in it. Social self formed in relations of difference. rather than sameness, rather than of unity and coherence. Identity becomes a problem when the self is constituted in the recognition of difference rather than sameness. So you've got so much on the table, so many options open to you, so much available to you that it's no longer either this or that. And that's where things get, I want to say, interesting, right? So back to the terminology that we kind of started this off with, let us take a deeper look, get a little more specific. So we've just said how identities can be either sort of attributed to us. This is what we think of as ascribed identities. So someone just goes, oh, okay, so woman, that means ABC. Oh, okay, refugee, that means ABC. Oh, okay, non-native, huh? That means ABC. So all those things may come into play, and it is not a problem so long as it's not kind of institutionally regulated. But some things, for a government, to be functional, for a country to work, for a certain society to work, they have to be more or less fixed. And so in certain institutional settings, there's certain processes and certain institutional types of categorization, and we're seen a certain way, right? So you are an adult past 18 years of age, so therefore you are to pay taxes as you go to work, la-di-da-di-da, right? So you're ascribed the identity of a taxpayer, for instance, right? So it could be anything that's got to do with institutions and the way society functions. But now we also got the inhabited identities, and it's become really loud, this part of identity discourse. Everyone gets to claim to be a certain something, and things have kind of gone too far with, kids claiming that they're animals. And as far as the gender identity, right, in certain parts of the world, the Western sector, there's been a lot of turbulence as far as this part of identity discourse is concerned. And when it comes to children and their parents and institutions deciding on what to do with someone's gender dysphoria, things are being talked about, and they're being talked about loudly, and people are disagreeing in a rather to a rather aggressive degree, and understandably so. So this just tells us how this new way of looking at things, relatively new, a couple of decades, the postmodern bit of the timeline has taken us to a place where we get to claim so many things when we've got certain privileges, and it's good to have those privileges. But again, someone who is not, say, born into a country cannot claim that they are, say, American if they're not American. That's just the way it works because of the passport issue, right? But that does not stop us from pursuing certain phonetic and aesthetic choices, and no one's going to stop us. And you can claim to be someone who is a fan of an American accent, or someone who is who's got certain allegiances and preferences, and it's completely up to you. And it's not like you're claiming to be someone you're not. So there's a lot of things, there's a lot of lines that get blurry, a lot of things that are objectively harmless, like claiming, yeah, I took on an American accent and I am not American or not American yet, and that is not a problem. Say, this is one of the manifestations of how this works. Now we got subjectivity. So subjectivity is basically a synonym for identity in academic literature. So how do I, this is not how so I, this is supposed to be how do I relate to the world? So how do I relate to the world, right? That is, there's conscious and unconscious thoughts, right? So it starts in psychology, and we got all those emotions, and they're all very much, any given individual's emotions, and they're going to be different. They're going to vary from person to person. And this sense of self, right, and our ways and our understanding of our relation to the world and how we position ourselves in the world, that is what is oftentimes described as subjectivity. And I really want you to think about subject being part of it. So we're no objects. We're subjects who get to think for ourselves, make decisions for ourselves, claim certain things for ourselves, not give much thought to the identities that are being ascribed to us that we're not okay with. Say, if you are from Russia, you are a militant, aggressive individual. Very few people who are in their right minds are going to claim that about you, but they have the right to, as long as they're not part of the government or something of the kind. And you may claim, hey, this is not who I am, right? So just very specific examples here. What else? We got identity that means subject, positions, and positionings. So again, when it comes to positions, right? So where are we located? Not physically, not geographically necessarily, but in the discourses accessible to us. If we were to think about what discourse is in academic literature, it's a very amorphous concept at this point. But if we were to look at a very specific, concrete description of it, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, one of the best out there, we get discussion or debate, formal, political, academic, what have you. So for instance, on social media, angry and aggressive voices seem to dominate the discourse. The discourse being what's being talked about and how that something is being talked about in terms of tone, in terms of ideology, in terms of ideas, principles that are being kind of imposed onto the public that's watching a certain conversation or listening to a certain conversation. So it's not actual conversation, not necessarily, but rather what it brings with it, right? So these ideas have been part of the public discourse for years. So the discourse in the US is very, say, anti-Russian, pro-Ukraine right now, and thank God for that, if you ask me, right? And then I am worried that these events could poison discourse between our nations for years to come. So discourse as in dialoguing, and again, taking on certain tones and certain, attitudes and moods to how we communicate with each other. So the discourse around gender in the US has gotten very problematic over the years because of the puberty blockers that kids, who haven't even turned 12 yet, seem to be taking under their doctor's supervision, but politically it's been thought of as a form of social hysteria, and there's good reasons to think so. And there's a lot of conversing around it. So that essentially is what discourse is. And every societal element, every idea that's crucial to a society develop in a certain way is going to be talked about a certain way. That includes voices, accents, voices in men and women, voices in locals and newcomers, voices, on the left, on the right, and in the center. There's discourse everywhere, and we are affected by the discourse. We watch Instagram, your news feed is basically your discourse. And positionings is basically how do we place ourselves with the inhabited, chosen identities that are informed by our choices and our values to at least a certain extent, and how do we basically claim to the world, this is where I want to be, and this is what I'm willing to do for it, right? How do we navigate the positions that we are ascribed and the positions that we ourselves take on, right? So now let us take a look at the historical perspective on things. We got language and identity. So language comes in, right? We've got, there's lots in between, of course, but we got to start somewhere. And I thought, antiquity is a good place to start. And today is a good place to end with for now, right? Starting with antiquity, we got Aristotle on the one hand and Epicurus on the other. And in short, in brief, right, as I'm painting a very general type picture, so it's not overly specific at this point, Aristotle believed there was no connection whatsoever between language and the nature of the people speaking the language, right? So it was very pragmatic, it was very straightforward. Again, things were a lot more rigid, straightforward back in the day. Things just were the way they were, and people didn't live very long, and most people didn't have any privileges. It made a whole lot of sense for him to look at things a certain way. But of course, there was someone on the other hand saying, hey, there's definitely a significant connection. Yet I gotta say, the kind of connection that Epicurus was referring to was a little more of essential biological nature. And he would claim that the language a people speaks would play a crucial role in making them a people. What he meant, though, was rather more primitive than the things that we're going to be looking at from a more modern and postmodern perspective. So he argued basically that the shapes of people's bodies varying by their ethnicity cause them to expel air differently, and that this combined with the effects of their environment shape their languages in profoundly distinct ways. So this is what we think of as an essential approach to things. You are what you are, you look how you look, you're placed in a certain geography. That means you can expel air a certain way, and your language is going to affect who you are, and you're going to affect the language. So basically, in antiquity, there was an understanding that there is a connection, but it's biological and geographical more than anything, or there is no connection or no critical connection. So why bother looking at it in the first place? Now we're going to move on to 15th and through the 17th century. So Renaissance, where things got a lot more sophisticated, and it had taken people a number of centuries to have gotten there. So this is where things have gotten a little more nuanced. And the nuance in question was very much based off Aristotle's and Epicurus' ideas, though, right? So is there a connection, or is there no significant connection? What do we got here? Pragmatic role and on to shared genius. What does that mean exactly? So the pragmatic role was more Aristotle-like. So, hey, language plays a very pragmatic role. It does what it has to do, and the people do what they have to do in order to proceed with whatever pursuits they may have, right? So the simple fact of being shared, right, binds the people together. So this is the language that we got going for us. This is what we developed over the years. So of course, whatever the language looks like, whatever its insides are, this is our language and we speak it, and it only happens because we have to, basically. Or we got this idea of a shared genius, which is a little more romantic. That's going to take us on to the next bit of the timeline in a minute's time. So the scholars believe that the particular form of genius was there, of their shared language, there as in a certain people's language, and it reflects what distinguishes the people who speak it from other people. And this is where it kind of invites us to think that every language has got a certain genius to it, a certain flair to it. What matters is that we came up with something that reflects who we are as a people, and we're special. So there's this idea of being special. So as we try to oppose these two views, we got different causes and different effects. So therefore, according to the pragmatic role of language, right, we got language being the cause and people being the way they are because, well, this is the language they developed over the years for whatever pragmatic reasons, and it binds them together, and that makes them a group that might identify as we're different than those guys are different than us, and this is shown in our language, amongst other things. Whereas with the shared genius idea, we basically got the people being the cause. We share this genius, we're this special group of people, and it was us and us only who could have come up with this kind of language, because this is how we have grown to be over the centuries, and the language is the effect. In truth, if we look at it, from up here in 2023, one informs the other, and it's a cycle, right? And there's no getting out of it, and you can go clockwise or anti-clockwise, and it's not like one is the cause, the other is the effect. It goes both ways. But back in the 17th century, that was not so clear to people. And again, scholars versus the non-scholars, there wasn't a lot of communication, a lot of feedback, a lot of back channels. It was just imposing top to bottom what is the truth. So things have gotten real more interesting since then. Now let us take a look at the 19th century, where things got, it's interesting because it's the 19th century, but it still kind of speaks to me a little bit because it explains my passion for languages to a certain extent. And I don't want it to be purely pragmatic or tactical or strategic. It's just that I do happen to fall in love with languages and the way they sound. And this is where romantics would have understood myself and I would understand them. So, what did romantics believe to be true? That language originates in the senses, and there's the so called national soul, right? Then again, if I only believed romantics to be correct about stuff, there would be no place for me in the national soul because I am not a national, right? But what is it that they believed? So, there's this romantic conception of a language as a deep spiritual vision of the universe that embodies the essence of a particular nation or race, even. So, very, again, essential views, which are very non modern. We're going to look at those terms in a bit. So, yeah. The idea of there being a soul to a language definitely speaks to me. The idea of only one nation being able to claim said soul, that does not speak to me at all. And that takes us to today's dichotomy, essential versus constructed, essential versus non-essential approaches to language learning and language speaking and language using, what have you. So we got basically conservative versus progressive, traditional versus non-traditional, if we were to try and use more political terms for a second. So basically we got what's given to us versus something that is co-constructed. So if I am a believer in the essential approach, I do not believe people to have the right to take on different identities or to change too much over, the whatever their lifespan is. So I, as an essentialist, would basically say, stay where you at. This is where you belong. So I'm primitivizing, but that's pretty much the idea. Whereas the constructivism, another kind of approach, tells us how we as subjects in a society get to co-construct each other's identities, ascribing and inhabiting, claiming and attributing. And it's a nonstop kind of process. And it's very fluid, and things get to change, especially because of migration and globalization, and people just moving a lot more around the world over the past century. So we construct and we co-construct. So it's not like you're just alone sitting in your room fantasizing about what it is you're going to be, right? So, conversing with people, you co-construct discourse around languages, around accents, around gender, around sexuality, whatever, right? Again, things might go too far in certain political instances, but in this presentation, I just want to talk about the possibilities open to us. And it says how we co-construct things intersubjectively. Again, my subjectivity, my identity versus your identity, and they inform each other. And if there's place and space for dialogue, we're safe, right? So that's the historical perspective, from no connection between language and people whatsoever to we the people get to construct our own language, our own identity, our own accents, our own what the heck ever it is that's of importance, significance, and help to us, because language is capital. So modernity, going on post-modernity. So modernity is basically, I think, the middle of the 20th century. Postmodern reality is past, let's say, 10, 15 years. So we're in a very different place where a lot more things are possible than back in the 1960s, for instance, right? So I want us to just, in a nutshell, ask yourselves the question, what do these perspectives that we're looking at have to say about identity? So biological essentialism, you are a woman, you cannot drive because your brain works that way. So it's very outdated, this kind of looking at things, no matter what part of a societal system you're trying to investigate. Structural determinism or essentialism that is not necessarily biological. You are a woman, you are a man, you guys got certain roles in life and you got to stick to them. Women don't go to work, men are breadwinners. That is it. What happens here is it used to work for some time, but people got curious. Namely, women got curious. and people started migrating. And so the status quo kept on being challenged by different parts of any given society, by different communities. And things were no longer in stone. And they never are anymore. And this is why things just kind of got too rocky at a certain point. And, certain pillars for us to stand on, I would still, suggest that we keep them. But, this is where the left and the right kind of balance each other out, politically speaking, right? Now, social constructivism, non-essentialism, basically postmodernism is a general term for how things are no longer set in stone. And social constructivism is a linguistic term for how things are no longer set in stone. And you can especially see that with pronouns. And that's all anyone can ever talk about in blue states and in red states here in the United States. So Republicans versus Democrats, people just have gone crazy over it. And we're going to talk about why social constructivism can be a little bit, not as innocuous as it claims to be, and can just cause more problems than solutions in a political sense. And society and politics are always going to be, somewhere in each other's vicinity. They're always going to be intertwined. So identity is a very political term, as a matter of fact, and it's inevitable. Moving on further. So essentialized, non-essentialized. To essentialize an identity and to look at it from a freer, more fluid perspective. Of course, I'm going to go right. I do not like things overly conservative. I do not like things being dictated to me. I want there to be a choice, right, in any matter. And linguistically speaking, first and foremost, if I want to have a Russian accent, I'm going to keep it. But I'm going to know where it is going to serve me and where it's not going to serve me. And it's going to be up to me, right? If I am looking to develop a certain phonetic image, I also got to think of it as a multi-layered task. And I need to know what it'll bring me, why I want it, and what it'll get me. And the non-essentialized approach allows me to go in that direction and investigate my options and, suggest to people that they do so as well. So we're definitely going right? Now, just a quick check-in, right? So what is essentialist? What is non-essentialist? So on the right, we got a book by a certain Deborah Tannen, and she talks about certain, it's a sociolinguistic, and I want to say psycholinguistic exploration into how men talk and how women talk. And basically, she claims, and she's got all kinds of research to back it up. She claims that we just don't hear each other because we're built differently in a more or less biological sense and in a societal sense, of course. And both those things are true as far as I'm concerned. They haven't been debunked entirely. But we also got this terrible book, Women Are from Venus, Men Are from Mars, or the other way around. And someone wrote a book, The Myth of Mars and Venus. Do men and women really speak different languages? And a lady named Deborah Cameron, also Deborah, claims and relies on her research how there is no such thing as the male language and the female language. Basically, she claims that there's a lot more to it. And it's fluid and it changes, and the society has changed. So those claims made by someone like Deborah Tannen are no longer reliable. And the thing is, neither of them is, a criminal in terms of informing the public. It's just that they come from different spaces, different places, different bits of the timeline in terms of perspective on identity throughout time. And they investigated differently. They constructed their research differently. And Deborah Tannen here on the right is more of an essentialist, whereas Deborah Cameron on the left is more of a non-essentialist, someone who's all about postmodern approach, where you get to co-construct, change, and invite fluidity into your decisions about yourself and your identity on a daily basis, which is a lot more exhausting, come to think of it, because you've got so many choices open to you. But I personally prefer exhausting and exhaustive to something that's set in stone and is categorically conservative. But again, there's a middle there somewhere. It really doesn't have to be one or the other when it comes to all of the societal elements of how we live. It's so not simple, and things are being simplified on different political platforms, and it drives me nuts, honestly. So moving on further, essentialism. So let's talk about what's good about it, what's not so good about it. There is great stuff to conservatism in languages as well. So creates binary identity categories, right? Men or women. There, of course, is straight and gay. That is no longer true for some reason. There's, of course, my least favorite dichotomy, native and non-native. I believe it to be very destructive, and I'm not alone. So let's take a look at what it says here. Basically, we need the world structured. If everything is going to be fluid, especially when it comes to, teaching our children stuff, well, the brain's going to go fluid. We need it structured to a certain degree. So creating knowledge, making sense of the world, who we are, we need to know that there's men and women, for instance, right? There's men and women. It exists. It's not a joke. Fosters group identity and collective action, right? So we need people on the left. We need people on the right. We need people following certain ideologies to function. It so happens that on the progressive side of things, people are more fluid. Therefore, they have a lot more trouble grouping into little groups and communities who are ready to take actions rather than talk about changing things. So this isn't me just attacking the left. I myself am a progressive, but we do got a problem, huge problem. Lots of talk and not a whole lot of action. And again, it's ideologically informed, but it's a blunt tool. I like this term so very much, that can result in overgeneralization and the ascription of stereotype group identities. So basically, men, women, from here, not from here, on the left, on the right, black, white. And it's interesting how it's the progressives who've been very much essentializing their own identities. Okay, white kid, I'm a black woman, I'm a woman of color. And it's basically sending yourself to, into this group and adhering to it like crazy and sticking to it, as opposed to making your own choices and not relying on group identities so much. Now we got marks one end of the binary as different in comparison to the unmarked end of the binary. So for instance, we got the normal and the abnormal. That is why we've developed terms like normative and non-normative, or, there's all kinds of euphemisms which have got a good reason to exist, right? To not call people who are different, quote unquote, a derogatory term. So that's where the idea of there being spectrums has come up in medicine as well, right? So there's a whole spectrum to autism. There's a whole spectrum to a narcissistic personality disorder. Everyone's got a little bit of something. Essentialism is going to kind of correct certain bits of it, and we're going to find ourselves in the middle in a couple years' time, hopefully. So yeah, often focuses on categories in isolation from each other. So there's no sense of integrity, one person being whole, where, I'm a woman and I can be so many things, but you tell me to be A, B, C. So again, that's kind of how essentialism works. Moving on to non-essentialism. So it takes a critical stance towards binary identity categories. So non-binary good, binary bad, right? Again, also a very binary stance. So it doesn't leave a lot of space for conservatism, politically speaking, as well. So we pay attention to diversity and differences inside the group, in between groups. So a lot of little groups, a lot of subgroups, a lot of substrata. Paying attention to human agency, you get to decide what it is you want to be and do the work that it takes for you to get there. Resourcefulness of humans to act. So if you are, say, something that's very much lacking in the post-Soviet world, unfortunately, how a person with certain disabilities is treated. So here, someone with a disability has got so much agency and so much space to decide on how they're going to go on about their life, whereas it's not quite the same for, say, a lot of Russian towns where you're treated as someone inferior. seeing identity as a multidimensional, right? So there's a lot to you as a person. You don't have to be like native, right? You can be someone who comes from a certain country, who comes from a certain culture, which also suggests that there's a certain capital to you as a person. You do not have to exclude it entirely in order to develop a nativeness or native likeness to yourself. I really want you to have space for all of those things so that you are not just a fragment of yourself. So intersectional things speak to each other, right? So there's this intra-communication. This part of me communicates with this part of me, right? I don't have to isolate the Russian in me in terms of what I know about myself in order to have a conversation in an American group of people where I speak with my American pronunciation, right? Located in discourse and negotiated in interaction. So again, we co-construct identities with the people that we choose to be around. People we don't choose to be around, they're going to ascribe stuff to us and we're going to let them, right? And negotiate is a beautiful word when it comes to applied linguistics and identity. You get to negotiate and renegotiate who you are as a speaker, for instance, as a voice user, in terms of, you know, what your capital is and what your power is. I'm not going to be afraid to use that word in terms of affecting people and how they think about someone who comes from Russia, let's say, right? So not militant assholes, but fine people who are trying to get out of this nightmare. Overemphasis on personal choice and individual freedom. So this is the but, this is the not so great point about non-essentialism. So this is where people have gone so crazy over pronouns and over what racism is here in the United States, especially. Actual problems are not being looked at. So a focus on addressing an individual's cultural rights, quote unquote, rather than addressing the material, actual inequalities that constrain an individual's life choices. So we're not looking at poverty, right? But we're looking at how not to hurt a person by calling them poor. So we call them unfortunate. By looking at racism in such, you know, novel manners, it really shifts focus. This is what we call neoliberalism. There's a lot of philosophers that talk about it. There's lots of stuff that you could, you know, read up on if it interests you at all, in terms of where we're going as a global society and what the pitfalls are. In truth, it's kind of like an imitation of getting better as a society. We're going to call things different names, but we're not really going to do much about how the society works. So on to the language part of it. And again, it's interdimensional, intersectional. All of this is your identity. And you don't have to, you know, like shout off of every corner about it, every roof, which again has become a tendency in the a lot of the Western societies. I'm this, I'm that, I'm this, I'm that. And this is what I want you to see me being as part of. I'm a Black woman of color. I totally respect that turn of phrase, by the way, but there's so many wonderful Black women, women of color in power who are, you know, asking us to kind of move on from this phrasing on to something a little more multidimensional. So just something that has been changing over the years and is really interesting to kind of register. So we got the culture, we got the ethnicity, we've got the language, we've got genders and sexuality that are being talked about left and right. And there's really no need to in this course, you guys. Nationality, religion, race, social class. Okay, so like something that's harder to talk about in light of all kinds of political correctness, but it won't stop existing if we, you know, stop talking about it. And then it could be more local, right? So we could get smaller slices of one's identity. So expert versus novice, boys versus girls, you know, gender, what is normative gender confirming versus non-binary, right? Good, poor language learner, you know, someone who shows a lot of resistance or someone who delves right in. Extrovert versus introvert, naughty versus nice. What the heck is that? I don't know. I like to be both on different occasions. Popular, unpopular. See, those are very much dichotomized. Teacher, student, those are factual. So all those things, right? There's so very many domains, so many dimensions, and we're all those things at once. something to really think about, how it's not just non-native, you know. So what do we got here? Identity and society. We've looked at the history and discourse, at the identity inscriptions. This is what I decide to be. This is what they decide I am. Let us take a look at what the other stands for and how there's a verb to other somebody. So Hegel went on to basically communicate this idea. Humans can only define themselves through recognizing our binary opposite. And that is where the act of defining other people in opposition to ourselves happens. So we got us versus them. Again, when someone says we just need to get rid of this tendency of our bodies, that's not quite, that's been proven to be possible. So we are going to other. Okay, that's how, this is what they believe, this is what we believe. But again, in a constructive discourse, there's place for both, and there's conversation, and therefore there's progress. So again, when you go native, non-native, right? Think about what's in between, what's in between native and non-native, and what sort of identities are you ascribing to all of the natives, and what sort of identity do you personally inhabit in terms of positioning when you decide for yourself, okay, I'm a non-native first and foremost. And am I proud to be one, or am I afraid to be one? Am I ashamed to be one? Am I embarrassed to be one? Am I mortified to say it out loud? Like really looking at it, because saying some things out loud, or at least in your head in a structured manner, it's very liberating at times. So we got, in terms of discourse, right, and othering, take a look at these examples here, right? There's a lot of othering going on in the world. It won't stop being part of it, right? We just got to recognize it. A lot of comedians I've seen recently talk about some sort of othering, whether it be of women, African Americans, Asian Americans, or whatever. And it's normally men versus women, African Americans versus white women, Asian Americans versus the rest of Americans, white people versus the rest of the world. So a lot of othering, and it's kind of been turned, right? Because it used to be the white population segregating and basically doing horrible things to its, soon to be fellow Americans. And there we are. Now there's a lot of othering that's kind of flipped. Now it's you white people who we can demonize. And it's so interesting to look at, observe, as opposed to internalize certain views and ideas and see them as our own. The country has a long history of the othering of foreigners. Another thing that you don't have to have so much power over you as a non-native. How else can we explain the persistence of political disrespect for deprived people, the othering, which no government opposes? So we got deprived people versus people who've, made things work for themselves, the marginalized part of the society versus the do-gooders and do-wellers, right? So there's all this othering, and it's also part of the essentialized parts of our biology where we need to see ourselves versus them. But it works both ways, right? So if we do not create space for more fluidity in our own way of looking at the world, it's, we kind of get caught in between all that, in the middle of this kind of thinking. And this is where we believe others to also, first of all, categorize us as, not from here, inferior. So there's really no need to kind of, stick to that version of things. Vocal fry, men versus women. I want to show you something, okay? And to think on it. So there's two little vids. Gotta make sure that there's sound being shared. First of all, you'll hear the vocal fry in the girl's voice. She overdoes it, no doubt about it. Look at how it's being reacted to. And think about whose side are you on, quote unquote. And whose side are you on when it's not this much vocal fry, but just a certain amount of it.
I get you.
I'd like a large coffee.
Okay, so hot coffee.
Hot coffee.
Okay, room for cream.
Totally leave room for cream.
Why are you talking like that?
Why are you talking like that?
Because this is my voice?
This is my voice.
No, it's not. I heard you talking a minute ago. I know you don't talk like that.
Neither do you, because nobody actually talks like this. You choose to talk like this, and today I chose to talk like this. Pretty fucking annoying, isn't it?
Why are you so rude, man?
Just stop doing that.
I can't help it. This is my voice.
No, it's not. It's an affectation that annoying teenagers and rich people use to sound like they don't give a shit. Except you work in a coffee shop, so I know you're not rich, and you don't look like a teenager. Unless you're Eunice Kennedy Shriver, knock it off.
So just because I talk like this means I don't give a shit? And what exactly am I supposed to not give a shit about?
That's an excellent question to ask yourself in your actual voice.
Excuse me. Some of us would like to order.
Fuck everybody.
You're a total dick, man.
There you go. Good. You're talking.
All right, and so let us take a look at this gentleman, Eric Singer, who is a dialect coach, an accent coach, a language enthusiast. I'm a huge fan. He works a lot with actors, and he's got a very non-toxic kind of professional image. So let's try and take advantage of it. He's going to talk about vocal fry in women against vocal fry in men, and kind of get us thinking about this binary way of looking at things. Is it just the women that make us feel a certain way about the vocal fry, or what?
Vocal fry and uptalk. You might associate vocal fry with speakers like Kim Kardashian
And I realized it was just the lighting.
or Lena Dunham.
My team's just been amazing, and I've got to give all my love to my team.
So what is vocal fry? Your vocal folds, which are right here, vibrate very, very rapidly when you're producing normal voice, what we call modal voice. That's probably about 180, 200 times per second. It's so fast you can't even hear the individual pulses. But if I slow that way, 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 way down by using a little bit less air, maybe I'm putting a little extra tension in here, you can start to hear the individual pulses of my vocal folds coming together. So you can try this at home. Let's all start on modal voice going, and then lower your pitch down until your voice starts to creak. It may help if you start to sort of run out of air a little bit. Now I'm Elmer Fudd. So what is uptalk or upspeak? It's going up at the end of a sentence, going up with your pitch using a rising tone. Hi, my name is Eric. Linguists call this high rising terminal at the end of a sentence. So these two vocal behaviors, fry and uptalk, come in for a lot of criticism. So what do people complain about? Well, they complain that fry and uptalk both can make you sound less intelligent, less sure of yourself, less trustworthy, less competent, less educated, even less attractive. Vocal fry is sometimes claimed to damage your voice, in fact. One thing it's hard not to notice is that most of the time when people are complaining about vocal fry and uptalk, they're complaining about women's voices, and especially young women. And it's not just women who do this. Let's try our own experiment, shall we? Let's take one sentence, the first sentence from the Gettysburg Address. I'm going to do it with some creak in my voice. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Eliza, would you do the same?
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
So what did you think? Do you have different associations when you hear it from a male voice 77 years ago than when you hear it from a female voice?
77 years ago.
So creaky voice actually has a linguistic function in some languages. In Danish, for example, the word hun, without any creak in your voice, means she, but the word hun means dog. So you have to actually put that creak in, and you can change the meaning of a word.
All right, so here we go, right? So again, something to ask ourselves about, right? So what is up with these discourses built around certain genders, the binary genders anyways, and how it affects our perception of the person talking, right? And we are going to talk about vocal fry this weekend because it's oftentimes part of the usage. It's oftentimes actually part of an accent, and that's something we can also talk about a lot and try a lot. All right. Moving on, identity and language. We got accents, dialects, and more. And then we got identity and you, what's open to you. So let us start with accents, dialects, and more. What's up with that? I want us to think about the word trans combined with national. Transnational identity. It's something that's real typical of today's world and of all the people here, I imagine. Most people watching this anyways. So we got this idea of a national identity traveling with you to the new country. So there is, of course, the option of assimilating completely and shaking off your original language, your original accent, your original capital, right, culturally and linguistically. Or there's the idea of keeping it and keeping at it to a certain degree. So in the Brighton Beach area here in New York, some people do not speak English, and they are okay. Same goes for Chinatown. Same goes for certain Korean communities, and I can go on and on and on. And it's not just here in the States. So again, there's certain things that are completed in English, but it is not their primary identity. So why is this important? Because when it comes to globalization, I just really want us to think about how much the world has changed and how this whole native versus non-native idea is super outdated. So we got things widening, intensifying, speeding up, and growing impact when it comes to traveling, migrating, and taking things on, but also taking things with you and bringing them into a context that's no longer pristine, that's no longer 100% this or 100% that is just no longer attainable. So social, political, economic activities across borders and continents are widening. Flows of trade, investment, finance, migration, culture, intensifying. Global interactions, processes for development, worldwide systems of transport and communication, speeding up. You can hop on a plane and go anywhere, again, if you're not part of a country that's been behaving very badly, unless it's the US. It's got a lot of privilege, doesn't it, worldwide. Growing impact, increasing effect of distant events on the local and vice versa. So this one is formulated a bit in a very obscure manner. But basically, there's global systems affecting every person's life, basically. Well, I don't want to say every person's life, but every person that's part of a global context, right? So there's someone who lives in their small town and doesn't use their phone, and it's okay. And a couple of beautiful terms here as well. We got the so-called technoscapes, financescapes, mediascapes, and ideascapes or ideascapes. So we got flows of technology, flows of money, information, ideas. So the language is changing. Look at how much Russian has changed over the years, how very Anglophone it has become, and anglicized with the terminology in the corporate world, how the whole of the world uses the corporate vocab, the corporate lexicon that is English, because again, the Western world rules when it comes to trading and when it comes to creating, when it comes to taking over the world by storm with technology and whatnot. So it's all very much explicable. We got either acculturation, assimilation, where, okay, I've moved, I forget this part of me entirely for whatever reasons. There's multiculturalism, which is going the other way, right? So it's like, no, I'm gonna embrace the whole of the diversity and versatility that's open to me. And it happens a lot for, expats, cosmopolitans, people who find themselves in bigger cities. And I'm one of them. And this is where I went, even though a huge part of me has acculturated and assimilated, because I've been crazy about the US ever since I was a little girl, because the 90s, Beverly Hills 90210, my mom was crazy about the States, and she worked a lot with Americans. So it just really happened for me super organically. So all those choices we make, right? Well, they are going to be informed by our histories, individual histories. Whereas transnationalism is more like, okay, I'm bringing in my nationality and I'm going to give most of myself to it, and I'm going to operate through the use of this original part of me more so than the assimilated part of me. And that's just something that's out there and is not a problem anymore, because because landscapes linguistically are growing more and more diverse, because it's good for, financially, it's good for the world, apparently. This takes us back to the dichotomy, inhabited versus ascribed. So people are going to inhabit identities, people are going to get identities ascribed to them, and it's okay. It's a circle. It's a negotiation. It's a co-constructing process. Just, got to be aware of it. And I really like being positioned in discourse versus taking up a position in discourse. Take up a position in discourse where you're not just the non-native, whatever that is to you, or rather give a new meaning to non-native. Like, hey, this is how much I've learned. I'm non-native. It might sound a little cheesy, but my goodness, it's got so much power to it. I can't not say it. This is a really highbrow quote. I'm still going to read it because, again, identity and language, their relationship is of real importance to us in this presentation. Identities are manifested in language as, first, the categories and labels that people attach to themselves and others to signal their belonging. A new word today, belonging. Such a huge concept. Do I belong in this discourse? Do I belong in the native discourse? Or do I have to keep myself somewhere in the non-native area that is embarrassing to me for some reason, right? Second, as the indexed, labeled a certain way, indexed ways of speaking and behaving, what the heck is that? Behaving through which they perform their belonging. So there's this idea of not us positioning ourselves, but performing a certain way, taking on a certain persona. Not such a huge fan of this approach because I like the idea of integrity, where all the parts of you are real. So it's not like wearing a mask or whatnot, but taking it on. This is where, the drama and acting comes in, and you just kind of connect with the monologue that you're working on, a shadowing that you're doing, and it's no longer just imitating but emulating, like I've been saying over the past 2 weeks. So we behave a certain way. My husband used to tell me that when he'd just come in and he just had this school English, that had been taught to him in his arsenal, and people didn't understand him a lot of the time, and it was behavioral as well. It's the face, it's the body language. There was a disconnect a lot of times. And he was saying, I felt like a square trying to fit into a circle. So again, there's certain things that you just kind of tweak and change organically throughout time to shorten the distance between yourself and someone who's a representative of a different culture linguistically as well. And finally, we got third as the interpretations that others make of those indices. So indices, a Latin form of index in the plural form. So it's just another way of saying indexes, right? Labels that are attributed to us. So there's interpretations of identities. There's identities that may be attributed to us, and then there's interpretations of identities, and then there's interpretations of interpretations. But it's all about how we see ourselves and why our vision of ourselves is informed a certain way. Which discourse are we turning to? Who are we listening to? What science informs my perception of me as a speaker? Some questions for you to think about. Definitely going to take this on this Sunday. So what languages have you inherited? So that is, you were born into it, or it was passed on to you by your grandma or your parents. Say you are the new generation in the US and you were born in the States, but your parents are from, say, Bulgaria, and you inherit their language, but it's not necessarily your first language, right? So, and that's something that's really interesting to think about, not just about yourself, but, other people in the world, and how we, again, co-negotiate our identities. What is your expertise in this inheritance? Okay. And what languages are you affiliated to? What allegiances do you have? So I have this allegiance to the US accent. Why? Why not British? Something to think about. And the final question is pretty elaborate. We're gonna skip it. What is a dialect? It's a variety of a language that differs from others along 3 dimensions. You got vocab, grammar, and pronunciation. Because they're forms of the same language. However, dialects are mutually intelligible. So people understand each other, even if the sound of a certain language is really, truly distinct from what you're used to. So say Australians versus Texans, right? So I really want us to not stop thinking about what do I want to take on? Do I like the East Coast stuff, the West Coast stuff? Do I want something that's a little more Midwestern, a little more general? Is there a particular person whose voice I enjoy listening to and I want to sound more like them? What is it about them that speaks to me so much? What parts of me am I going to hold on to? What am I not going to latch on to, and why? So many options. My goodness. Again, fluidity. Everything is at your disposal. It's a matter of making choices that are informed by your preferences and well thought out answers to questions about your identity.
New York City, Trenton, North Carolina, Edricoke Island, Mississippi, and northern Florida. That's where you get the sort of Blanche Dubois, Scarlett O'Hara kind of classical Southern accent. Hi, my name is Eric Singer. I'm a dialect coach. Today we're going to take a little tour of some of the different accents of English-speaking North America. Now, a couple of quick disclaimers. These are by no means all the accents in North America or even all the English-speaking ones. And not everyone from the same place sounds the same. Accents vary by socioeconomic background, generation, ethnicity, and race, and all kinds of individual factors. Because in a very real way, accent is identity. Different people from the same place have more or less localizable accents, and that usually has to do with identity too. Now, on some of our stops, we're going to be looking at some of the most distinctive and interesting local features, but it doesn't mean that everyone from there has that accent or has it to the same degree. I'm also going to have some linguists and language experts from around the continent join me today to lend their expertise in some of these areas.
Hi, I'm Megan Figueroa.
Hi, I'm Nicole.
Peace. I'm Sun Michaud.
Hi, I'm Kalina.
Hi, I'm Imani Doran.
One of the things you'll notice along the way is that accents often don't follow political boundaries, especially ones like state lines. They'll follow major geographical boundaries, things like mountains for sure, but what regional accent differences mostly reflect is settlement patterns and contact. Historically isolated communities like Ocracoke Island in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, or the Sea Islands in the Lowcountry in Georgia, can have really distinctive speechways. They've had the time and isolation necessary to diverge and develop them. That's the other thing that makes for accent variety: time. There's a lot more accent diversity in the British Isles, for example, where there are local populations that have been speaking English in their particular way for hundreds and hundreds of years. And there's more accent diversity on the east coast of the US than there is west of the Mississippi. It's been settled by English speakers longer. The first places English was spoken in North America were Roanoke, Jamestown, and of course, Plymouth, Massachusetts, where the Pilgrims landed in 1620. So let's start there. The Pilgrims spoke with what we call rhotic accents, meaning they said all their R's. In fact, so did almost all English speakers in 1620, including the ones in England. That's right, a Southern English accent might have used to sound something like this. It was only in the late 18th century that fashionable young people in and around London started dropping their R's, and from there the trend spread to America. Now, north of Plymouth Rock, we have Harvard Yard, one of the places you might hear a Boston accent today. The stereotypical Boston accents, of course, are non-rhotic, meaning no R sounds in park your car in Harvard Yard. Let's all get in the car and head south down the coast now into Rhode Island.
What is Ebonics? So let me just show you a vid, and then I'm going to send you the full version of it so that you make an even better sense of what it is and how problematic the treatment of it has been over the years. So again, languages are very social, and therefore they're always political, whether we like that or not. Let's take a look.
This morning's hearing relates to the subject of Ebonics, which is a term derived from ebony black and phonic sound, There has been considerable discussion, really controversy, and concerns as to whether Ebonics is a separate language and as such undesirable, or whether it is a teaching skill and a bridge for some to perfect and learn language skills.
I think Ebonics is absurd. This is a political correctness that simply has gone out of control.
Many of the children who come to us have language systems that are not consistent with standard English. We have not taken a position as to whether it is a language. We simply acknowledge that these systems exist.
If you're taught, as you are in a society like this one, that default English is what I'm doing right here, then anything else seems lesser. It seems like it's, well, just a dialect, as people put it. So, real language is in the Wall Street Journal. Then there's all this other stuff that's only spoken, and, it's in hip-hop, and, well, they keep using bad words, and so especially that one. Black English especially. That's no good. That's not real. So it's the responsibility of somebody like me to explain how many sophisticated things are going on in this supposedly broken down speech. My name is John McWhorter. I teach linguistics at Columbia University. I host the podcast Lexicon Valley, and I'm a contributing editor at The Atlantic. Linguistics is the study not so much of what people say, but how they say it. It's the scientific study of language. It's an umbrella term. The idea that there's a white way of speaking and a black way of speaking can sound like what someone like me is saying is that at first everybody talked one way and then black people ran off into a corner and started talking in their own way, and damn it, why don't they stop that? It wasn't anything like that. Really, it's this. Black English is English because Black English is spoken here and we're around so many English speakers. But it is something that has lasted a very long time. It is something now that has a whole history of transmogrification over the centuries. It is something that has informed what is the world's most popular music. Why in the world are people using Black English terms in New Guinea? I've heard it. I have heard people in New Guinea who don't speak a word of English, but are rapping in whatever they're rapping in. And there are all sorts of words and little phrases that are from Black English spoken in the United States. They'll never meet a black person. Or if I met them, I was the one they'll ever meet. That's it. And this is going on in China. That's a pretty amazing thing, given where Black English started.
Again, why are we talking about this? For you to really assess the scope of versatility to languages and to an accent, so that there isn't an idea of some native accent that's good and all the other accents that are somehow subpar. Finally, identity and you. What's open to you? I want to talk to you about two terms here, right? So self and ethos, that is how you feel yourself to be. So I feel myself to be a certain way emotionally and effectively. So these are my inner qualities. So what do you associate with the American accent that you find to be true for you in terms of your personal qualities? Also something to think on. Then there's the term persona, right? Which takes us back to the approach of performative speaking, where you kind of take on an identity and project onto others, like a mask that used to project a social role or a position in self in relation to others. Sometimes it's healthy, like at work, where you get very, serious, and you're lots less so in a certain group of people, and it's shown in your voice, not just in terms of accent, but in terms of pitch, in terms of resonance, in terms of whatever, in terms of what feels right to you in a given context. So in that sense, yes, there's identities and there's multiple identities that we might be projecting, but they're all part of ourselves as opposed to masks that we put on, and they're so not in connection with our values or how we feel about ourselves that it doesn't really make sense to put it back on. So something to think on always. Another idea that that resonates with me and speaks to me, and I hope it'll do the same for you. Identity as an in-process, ongoing substance. It is fluid, it changes, and it's a plausible fluidities, right? So we can be what we're not, okay, biologically or otherwise. Kids cannot be kittens, but there is plausible changes that are open to us. Plausible alterations, plausible, again, what is an accent, right? Accentuating certain parts of certain, phrasing, and learning to do so organically and with commitment. So that's something that I really, really do invite you to think about a lot and kind of register for yourself when you do a shadowing or when you talk to people. What is it that I'm inviting into my own identity that's different than, the 6 months ago version of me? And am I connecting with it? Is it something that's been just imposed onto me, or has it been my choice all along? So also, really, really, truly know what those responses are, and which are going to come from here and which are going to come from, top to bottom somewhere because the discourse has told you so. Just something to always be aware of, so that there's no space of toxicity in terms of what I am and what I'm not. Native, not native. Okay, and so yeah, like a native, I'm just going to read a little quote here. So for a scholar named Davis, the native speaker is a myth with dangerous and destructive consequences for language teaching and above all for language testing. It is mythical because in reality there is no clear boundary between native and non-native speakers. There are people who even starting well after puberty learn a language to such a level of competence that they're scarcely distinguishable from native speakers. Whatever fine differences, teeny differences in grammaticality judgments psycholinguists may detect belong to the research laboratory and not to everyday life. In Davis's view, the native speaker myth is destructive because it gives learners the message that however strong their motivation and however great their efforts, they can never teach the ultimate goal of foreign language teaching by virtue of their birth and other conditions beyond their control. Just something to really, truly ponder on. Okay? Language is capital, and you're adding to your capital. You listen, you observe, you compare, you make informed choices about what it is that you like, what it is that's of importance in order to be understood better and be connected with more easily. So you're rocking it already. You are very much getting there. And I want it to be a very informed type trajectory. These are some of your answers to the question, how are your first language identity and your English speaking identity similar, and how are they different? So I just want you to take a look for yourself. It's real interesting to look at someone else's perspective and compare it to your own. Again, co-constructing the answers as part of one Russian speaking community, and again, community that speaks multiple languages. There we go. And these are the questions that I definitely look to hear your answers to during the upcoming Sunday session, okay? Because this is a little more personal, a little more drama-oriented, not at all academic. Questions about how you feel about your voice, right? So, and the people that you work with, and the people that you just talk to outside of your, work-related obligations. And if you have answers, you're good. This was basically an attempt to structure something that's not easy to structure. And it has been, scholars from all over the world have been trying to do so, and they're still arguing about things. And I want you to have a couple of evocative conversations with yourself where you are essentialist and non-essentialist, where you are conservative and non-conservative, where you are in touch with your own needs, wants, and then someone else's wants, and then how they might be corresponding with yours. And that is completely healthy. Just knowing what drives you and what it is that's accessible to you and what terminology is going to present your identity to you. Back to the dichotomy, native, non-native. I really was looking to challenge it via presenting all that's available to us today in the realm of identity studies. So there you go. Talk to you soon.
I am so sorry for taking everyone's time. This is not at all who I am. I will